Welcome to the Holistic Accountant Podcast. This is where we cut through conventional accounting and show you how a genuinely holistic approach drives better after-tax outcomes. It's not about ticking boxes or churning out tax returns. It's about strategic advice that builds lasting wealth. If you find this episode valuable, leave a rating and share it with someone who will benefit. Okay, today, Mena, would like to talk about building a great and effective team and probably really just sharing some of our own experiences as we like to do through the podcast, because being self-employed requires good team management. And sometimes, when we get into business, we don't come necessarily with a lot of experience in that regard. And we've got to kind of learn as we go, but it's an expensive learning process sometimes because, of course, in lots of businesses, payroll is one of their largest expenses. So I think the overarching sort of theme of today's episode is that clarity matters. Sometimes as business owners, we might reflect on performance or activity levels and draw a conclusion that, the person doesn't care, they're not putting in enough effort, and that's the problem. And it could be the problem, but I think a lot more problems are a result of poor clarity. I think most people want to come to work and do a good job. Most people don't want to go home at the end of the day and feel like they've done a terrible job, of course. And so really it's just about setting expectations, communicating clearly, and that's what we wanted to talk about today.
And we have a common saying here, and you probably heard it on this podcast before, that we always say that when something goes wrong in the business, we always blame the system and not the person. And I think that really comes down to the fact that you really need to articulate what that system really looks like. The system doesn't necessarily mean like an SOP as such. It's equally as important for you to communicate what great actually looks like. So you need to communicate to your staff what a great job looks like, what taking ownership of a role looks like as well. So you need to set clear expectations around quality, around turnaround time, communication preferences and standards, and ownership levels. So this improves your whole customer or client experience. So by giving vague answers or lack of instructions, people are just left to their own vices. They're not going to do the right thing. They're not going to do the right thing by your business or anything like that. So at the end of the day, you can't manage what you don't measure. So it's really important for you to stay on top of your staff, to check in. So not only once you've got a sort of an SOP in place and you've set those clear expectations, it's really important to regularly touch base and make sure that the people are being held accountable for their work.
Mena loves acronyms, by the way, so just in case anyone's not familiar, SOP is Standard Operating Procedure. But sometimes we confuse misunderstanding with more communication, shouting louder, not in a literal sense, but metaphorically. Whereas what we really need to do is engage with our team. Firstly, to help them understand, as Mena said, what the expected level of outcome we wanted here, but also to help them understand why that's important. It might not be obvious to someone that might be in sales, for example, of why they need to do something because it has an operational issue later on. And so if they understand why something is important and how their process or what they're doing, their tasks, how it all fits in and why it's important is really important. And so it's not just then about broadcasting, this is what we need to do. It's about engaging with your team members and making sure that they really understand, testing their understandability, taking them through the process. That's why we need to have great standard operating procedures. We need to have an operating manual, all those sorts of things. But, part of that training needs to be observing the person in the role and calling out when good is not achieved. So I don't think you can overdo it. I don't think you can really over-communicate. You can over-communicate in a way that's not effective and keep communicating in a non-effective way. Of course, you can do that. It's like banging your head against the wall. But trying different approaches with different team members and finding the approach that's really going to resonate with either that team or that team member is what's critical in ensuring everyone understands the direction we're heading and what's acceptable in our business. We do things like this around here, and also what's not acceptable. This is just not how we do it. And if you want to be part of our team, you've got to do it this way.
Yeah, that's right, Stuart. And I think once you've established that, you really need to build a rhythm of communication, a rhythm for how often you're going to check in with your staff to ensure that everything that you've communicated is actually being fulfilled. So where most businesses fail, in my view, is that they don't regularly check in. They only check in when a system or process or an individual has actually broken down. So they're being reactive rather than proactive. The businesses that do succeed are the ones that do actually have those regular meeting rhythms. Now, we don't want to create a meeting every week to necessarily to just touch base on sort of mundane tasks, but there should be some sort of rhythm to make sure that these mundane tasks are actually being completed and how often they're being completed and what the expectations are like. Has there been anything that we need to adapt to improve the process and get the staff actually involved in the conversation?
That's right, Mina. So Vern Harnish wrote a book called Rockefeller Habits. And in one of those, one of these key sort of themes in that book, and he's written another book called Scaling Up. They're both very good books. And he talks about meeting rhythm. And one of the first kind of meeting rhythms we can have is a daily huddle. Sometimes it's called a stand-up meeting. And the reason, they call it a stand-up meeting is everyone stands up to have the meeting. That way it's short and succinct. You don't want to turn it into, just a boring kind of status update or turn it into a management meeting. It really should be used as a short alignment tool. So just really getting the team really focused on, okay, what's today's priorities? What's stuck? What do we need to get unstuck today? What support do people need? And really is almost a little bit of a motivation tool so people really understand the direction that we're going to head today. Now, it's going to be different for every business. Sometimes those daily meetings work really well. Other times they're unnecessary. And so don't take it literally as a daily meeting. Maybe you do it a couple of times a week, at the beginning on a Monday and midweek, for example. It's just like a check-in, make sure we're all aligned, make sure everything's moving in the right direction, and just a way for people to sort of voice feedback in that sort of group atmosphere. They should last, no longer than 15 minutes. They're short and succinct. As I said, you don't want it to end up to being just into a talk fest, and alignment is the key outcome.
Now, bi-weekly short might be a bit excessive for some businesses, but for larger businesses, at least a weekly meeting will get you into that right rhythm. And it's not necessarily a meeting where you're sort of fighting obstacles or just talking about issues. It's more so talking about operational improvement. I know something we do in our business here is that we encourage our staff to think about 1% improvements. So things that we can improve by 1% each and every time that will yield a greater result over the course of the year. So it's really important to create a practical agenda for your staff or for these meetings. Otherwise, these meetings can go on and go on various tangents, which we've found in the past. So it's really important to keep these succinct so it doesn't deter the staff from actually doing their actual work. And this is where leaders really step up. It's where leaders can stop blaming people and really start improving the system around them. It allows them to celebrate wins and get everyone really involved in the process so people feel accountable and proud of the work that they actually do.
Okay, so we've got daily huddles, we've got the weekly meeting, and the final in the meeting cadence is a monthly meeting. And this is where we talk about kind of bigger ticket items. This is where maybe the whole business is present or the whole division rather than smaller teams. And it's really to get everyone on the same page. You might review KPIs, scorecards, capacity issues, health of the system, these sorts of things. Communicate major changes, that again, you can't over communicate in a business. People like to know what's going on. They like to be kind of part of the process and they don't like surprises. So, communicating where the business is going, what you're working on, what you're considering changing, getting their feedback and getting their buy-in. So, when you communicate a change, it's also good to seek feedback so that people can feel like they've had some input in framing the direction of those particular changes. Recognizing performance, and calling that out, in a public sphere obviously makes people feel really good. And it could be also used for targeted training. Now, I'm not talking about a 2 or 3 hour training course or something like that. It's really, if there's small gaps missing in terms of skills or understanding new tool or system, the monthly meetings are probably the best place to do that. And to build that cadence, I mean, when you're in a very, very micro business, a very small business, so only a few people, you might only have the monthly meetings because, the daily huddles are almost replaced because you're always talking to each other. But as a business scales, so should the meeting cadence. And it's not about filling everyone's diary with hundreds of different meetings and turning it into a talk fest. Remember, sometimes communication is best done offline. You don't have to be in one room for me to sit here and read out a bulletin, for example, but there's some communication that should be done face to face, particularly if it's really important and key. So we will talk in our monthly monthly meetings about how we're interacting with clients, how we're collaborating with each other, how we can improve collaboration between service lines. These sorts of things are key and critical to our business, and we want to really engage our team in a conversation around these matters.
And then I think what's important to do, Stuart, is then to create scorecards. Like what we've seen in our business, for example, is that staff really sort of react or can understand visual representations of their KPIs or metrics. Now, these scorecards aren't necessarily overly engineered. It focuses on maybe 3 to 5 key sort of expectations, but it creates a lot more credibility with staff. It keeps them accountable for the work that they're doing, and it ensures the whole business is winning. It makes sure that people aren't dropping their standards, and it connects their KPIs back to their role clarity. So this really allows management to call out issues early on. So if the scorecards aren't, or the staff aren't meeting their sort of KPIs that are sort of being measured on their scorecards, not only are the staff sort of visually and sort of aware of it at that point in time, it allows leaders to get involved at that point in time to sort of trigger either coaching or improvement, and without sort of waiting to like a biannual or annual review.
I guess one of the possible outcomes of opening up communication is that you receive some friction, some negative feedback, for instance. There's a entrepreneur coach called Dave Ramsey in the US. He's got a podcast, in fact. It's really good. I enjoy listening to it. And in his business, he talks about complaining up. So you're not allowed to complain to your peers, but you're allowed to complain up, which means go to your manager. If you've got something that you don't like, complain to them about it. And then they can have a discussion around, why we're doing something in a certain way or why a decision was made, and take that feedback. And maybe as a result of your feedback, the outcome changes, or maybe it doesn't. And maybe you can just agree to disagree. But the worst thing, the thing that you want to avoid in your business is peers complaining with each other. So they go to a meeting, the boss says, this is the way we're going to do it. They go back to their desk and go, oh, that's a bit crap. We don't think that's the right way to go about it. And it just festers and creates a really bad culture. What you want to do is actually encourage the feedback. And so what you want is that people go to a meeting, they disagree. They might not be brave enough to mention that in the meeting. That's okay. I mean, you want to encourage them to do that, but not everyone's going to be in a situation where they want to do that. But after the fact, they should go to their manager and say, we don't like this. I don't like this. I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't think it's the right approach. At the end of the day, everyone wants to be on the same team, on the same page. They're there to achieve the same outcomes. And so it's entirely possible that by them sharing their feedback, that you can actually make a tighter or more robust system, or it's a flag for some training. And so that to help the person understand why there might be down or upstream reasons of why we're doing something the way that we're doing it. The idea of greater communication isn't to never receive negative feedback. It's in fact to solicit and pull that negative feedback out of your team in a way that's constructive.
And this is where leaders really get it wrong. They sort of create a whole bunch of meetings where they dump a whole bunch of information, and it's all about direction rather than sort of an encouragement around the discussion around the process. So it's really important for leaders to actually encourage their staff to be involved in the conversation, like Stuart mentioned. Otherwise, things do go wrong. The common mistakes are that there's too many meetings or no follow through, or the expectations are all in the leader or owner's head and it constantly changes. We don't know where the priorities are. And when there's too much silence, automatically employees think that things are going well. There's nothing going wrong. It's only when I get called up on something, then something's going wrong. So I really think it's important for leaders to be involved in that conversation frequently, like we mentioned. And it also challenges founders to get out of their own head and understand that the process that's actually underlying or underpinning the actual work that's being sort of performed. So it's really important that if the issues keep reappearing, then the communication system is broken. It's not necessarily on the employee. You need to really question, okay, is my SOP documented, and do I have the right metrics in place, and have I given the staff member the right tools to complete their work? If the answer is yes to all those questions, then you've got a person problem. If the answer is no to any of those, then you've got a process problem. So that's really important for leaders to be involved in that conversation and be involved with the staff to encourage the collaboration around the work.
So there you go. That's our approach to dealing with, in quotations, people problems. As Mena says, were the expectations clear? Does the system support the outcome? Sometimes if we're remunerating someone on a commission basis and then we're punishing them for acting in a way that maximizes their commission, that doesn't make sense either. The other thing to ask is capability. Does the capability exist? So sometimes we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes the person just doesn't have the ability or capability or training or experience to actually thrive in that role. But if you can check all those things before then just blaming motivation, I think typically not only is it going to help you build a stronger business, so across the board and across your whole team, you're less likely to have problems now and in the future, but it's also going to help you deal with any perceived underperformance issues with particular team members at any particular time. And I think it's just the fairest thing to do, even providing negative feedback to a team member that in fact might be lazy, might be a bit shy in motivation, might not be doing their job with care and diligence. The fairest thing to do in that situation is to provide that communication, that feedback, as promptly as possible in a very respectful manner and in a way that says to them, hey, I'm here to help you thrive at doing your job. Now, of course, if you engage in that process and the effort isn't returned, then you've got a problem that you need to deal with. But I think most people problems are really communication problems, which is what we're addressed today. Okay, we'll leave it there for today. Until next week, bye for now.